بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Welcome everyone to the first session of Being Muslim. And we begin in the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful, and sending peace and blessings upon the Prophet Muhammad and upon all the prophets and messengers of God throughout time and in every human culture and race. It's an extreme honor for me to be here with you all today at Seekers Hub Toronto, which is also a center of excellence and spiritual refinement and education and knowledge, and a center of radiance and beauty and light. And it's a distinct honor for me to be here because this is a center that I come to for learning and for growth for myself. So when Ustadh Umar and Sheikh Faraz told me that they would like to do this class and they invited me to have the honor of teaching it, it was a great blessing, and I'm very thankful to be here with you all today. And I'm very excited about this course because it's a very important course. Being Muslim, an introduction, a clear introduction to Islam, is really one of the most important things that we need to talk about in our communities and our societies today. We live in a very multicultural and diverse society in North America and Canada particularly, and in Toronto. And one of the things that we need to do, the Quran teaches us that the wisdom of God creating different tribes and nations and peoples and cultures and so forth is لِتَعَارَفُوا, so that you can know one another, that you can recognize one another, you can get to appreciate the diversity of God's creation. So I'm very excited about teaching this, and I think it is extremely important because we live in a time where it's very easy to have assumptions about one another, and particularly to have assumptions or misunderstandings about Islam. So this course, Being Muslim, is giving people an introduction to Islam as it's understood and lived by Muslims today, and how it's been understood historically by the Muslim community generation to generation from the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. So I'm happy to start this journey with you all, and I ask God that it is blessed and beneficial, and that we all grow and learn, and that we're all seeking some greater truth and some greater benefit, and that He grants us that through His generosity and grace. Another thing before we start, I want everyone to feel free to ask questions. That we want to have this be an open environment where people feel comfortable asking questions. If anything that I say is not clear, feel free to raise your hand and ask for clarification. If I say anything that you don't understand or whatever it may be, at any time, feel free to raise your hand and ask any questions that you may have. So Bismillah, in God's name. The Basmala, when I started saying Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. This means in the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful. And this phrase is an extremely important phrase within Islam and to Muslims, because we start every endeavor of importance remembering God, directing ourselves towards God, seeking His good pleasure and nearness to the divine, glorious and exalted. The Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, he said anything of value, anything of benefit that does not start with God's name or does not start with God's praise, or does not start in the remembrance of God, is cut off from blessings and so forth. Another reason I wanted to start with this is because Arabic is the sacred language of Islam. Much like one could look at Hebrew as a sacred language of Judaism, Arabic is the sacred language of Islam, and it is the language of the Quran. It is the language of revelation. So within Islam, when a person is learning about Islam or seeking to learn about Islam, undoubtedly they're going to come across a lot of Arabic terms. One of the things that we're going to be committed to in this course, particularly because it's an introductory course, and it's meant to be accessible to all people, is that we'll translate things into English. Now, if I say a word in Arabic, technical or otherwise, and I don't translate it, your job is to stop me and say, oh, you forgot to translate that. What does that mean? Okay, so please feel free to do that if I forget to translate anything in Arabic. Okay, so that's just a little bit about the Arabic language and starting in God's name. The story behind being Muslim. So being Muslim is actually a book that is very close to publication, God willing, inshallah. It is a book that my older brother, Dr. Ustadh Tarsin, wrote several years ago, and the way that he started writing it, the purpose behind him wanting to write this book, is that he became friends with a young man who was just graduating from high school, and my brother was invited to speak at this high school about Islam, just to give a presentation about Islam, what do Muslims believe, and so forth, like an introductory presentation. And after the presentation, this young man approached my brother, and he had already been interested in Islam, and a lot of his questions were answered, so he told my brother, I want to become Muslim. I believe in this, and I want to become Muslim. So he became Muslim, and then he started asking my brother all kinds of different questions, really good questions, but it was apparent to my brother that if someone is coming into this religion and they're newly practicing it, and they don't have any background like in their family or any previous education about Islam, there's a lot of things that Muslims take for granted that a new Muslim would be a completely new learning experience for them. So something that might be obvious to someone who grew up Muslim is not obvious to someone who's a new Muslim. So, he would call my brother and he would say, okay, so no pork, right? My brother would be like, yeah, no pork. And be like, okay, what else? What else do I need to do? Give me more. And, he was just really hungry for learning. He really wanted to dedicate his life to God and find those things that were pleasing to God. So my brother, he thought about it. He said, what books can I give him? What can I direct him towards? So that he can get, he can learn on his own, because some of the questions were kind of difficult. And becoming Muslim or learning about Islam or just assuming that people find this way of life to be easy is not always the case. So he would even ask questions like, okay, so I can't kiss my girlfriend when I'm fasting. I'm really like, okay, where do I start? Right? From an Islamic lifestyle aspect, there's a lot that goes into that question. There's a lot of, prerequisite understanding before you're even able to get to that question. So my brother's like, okay, I don't want to shock him. I don't want to overburden him. So let me get him a book that can he can come to these understandings on his own, and he might not feel embarrassed or shy about certain things. So my brother started looking into books, and he found two sort of sets of books. Ones that were written for children, and that's not really something that an adult who's learning about Islam wants to read. And others that were already at a certain advanced level that assumed a background knowledge and understanding of Islam to begin with. So he had a difficult time figuring out, what book do I give him? How do I give him an introductory sort of understanding, step-by-step understanding of Islam and being Muslim, what it means to be Muslim. So he found books that had a lot of Arabic in them, or books that were sort of like for children. You need to listen to Mama and Baba, And he's like, okay, this isn't going to work for someone in university. So being Muslim was born. May God accept his efforts. I would see him, and he's a full-time doctor. Like that doesn't take up enough time in one's life. But I would see him with my own eyes. He would stay up at night after his kids would go to bed, and he would just write this book. And he'd say, what should I write about? This can be one chapter. And he would wake up and go to sleep thinking about the most accessible ways to translate certain technical words from Arabic to English. So we would have conversations about circumambulation. What's circumambulation? Tawaf. When there's a certain religious rite of circling around the Kaaba. But for us, it was like an aha moment. We're like, hey, why don't we just say circling? It's like, oh my God, that works. Because technically you'll find circumambulation or ablutions, all these like really strange translations that nobody uses in common English, right? So you say ablution, person's like, what's ablution? Like, I've never used that word my whole life. So we would have these conversations, and for 2 years he was writing this book, right? And after 2 years he finished writing it. But then it was like, is this really good for people? Is this really like the best sort of outline, the best material to teach people who are interested in Islam or new to Islam? So he said, let me try it out with a group of people in the area and just teach from it and see how people accept it, see how they react to it, if it's actually worthwhile, if it's relevant to their lives or not. So he taught it when he was living in Michigan, and now currently it's being taught at several different centers that have introductory to Islam courses and convert care services, like the Ta'leef Collective in San Francisco, now here at Seekers Hub Toronto, and other places where people are teaching it. We actually taught it through the Muslim chaplaincy about 1.5 years ago at the University of Toronto. People at the Green Room in Edmonton, they also use it as a course to teach people who are interested in learning a little bit about Islam. And the feedback has been positive, and he's been implementing all of the comments that he's received from the course. And alhamdulillah, after now working at it for 5 years, the book is ready for publication. So God willing, by the end of this course, this 12-week course of being Muslim here, we'll have physical copies of the book, inshallah, God willing. So that's kind of how being Muslim came about. There's a beautiful verse of the Quran. That's not the verse on the screen. There's a beautiful verse of the Quran that teaches us about emotional sensitivity, cultural sensitivity, and even sort of the sensitivity of language and knowing the language. God says in the Quran, and I'm paraphrasing, that we never sent a messenger to a people except that they called them by their own language. Except that they would call them by their own language. And, some scholars have commented on that. It means that they know how to communicate with their people. That these prophets and messengers were chosen by God and were inspired to speak to their people in a way that they could relate to. And one of the things that now it's changed. I would say definitely in the last 5 to 10 years it's changed. But for a long time, the literature that you could get on Islam in English sometimes wasn't the most accessible English, or sometimes it wasn't the best translations, right? So language is really important. And that was also something taken into consideration with being Muslim, is talking to people in their language, translating terms, relating to people, making it culturally relevant for someone in a North American context or other contexts, right? It's not that the North American context is the most important, but that's the one that we're currently in, here in Canada and the US. And inshallah, God willing, it applies to people in other parts of the world as well. So, here it says, let's eat, Grandpa. Let's eat, Grandpa, right? And it's kind of a little funny joke on how punctuation and knowing how to speak to people, Zahra got it. Knowing how to speak to people, it makes a difference, right? It makes a difference. And I remember when we were growing up, as second generation Muslim Americans, there's a certain point in our life, I can say, where we have to come to terms with, do we really want to be Muslim or not? Like, is this religion? I know that's what my parents do, but is this really something for me or not? And one of the things that was a huge barrier for us growing up is that we would always, it was bad, it's not a good thing to do, but we were kids, we would always make fun of, imams and speakers who had thick accents. And we would totally miss the message and just, focus on the way that they said certain words in a funny way, right? We were kids, we were being facetious. But, there is a wisdom in the fact that you're able to connect and speak with people at the level that they're at and in a way that they can appreciate. So that's just a little bit of background about being Muslim. That's a little bit of background about how the book became the project that it did become, and the importance of having this clear communication. Because unfortunately there's so much miscommunication, there's so much of, bad news in the world that creates divides between people, and we lose out on the opportunity to celebrate this diversity and actually get to know one another as we understand ourselves. So if I'm trying to get to know someone, I don't truly get to know them by assuming certain things about them, right? Just by looking at them or what I might have heard about them. The way that I really get to know someone is, tell me about yourself. What do you feel? What did you go through? What are your thoughts on these things, right? As opposed to, okay, so-and-so dresses a certain way, they must be like this. So-and-so eats certain food, they must be like that. That's not a true understanding and celebration of knowing one another and recognizing one another. So, it's a lofty goal, but the goal behind being Muslim is really being able to connect with people and being able to communicate Islam as the vast majority of Muslims have understood it for the last 1400 years in a North American English-speaking context. Right? So we ask God for His assistance and ability. Moving on. Advice for the journey. This particular portion will apply to those who are newly Muslim or who have become Muslim relatively recently or who have embraced Islam recently. And it also can apply to a Muslim who's kind of re-engaging, right? Someone who was raised Muslim but is kind of trying to figure out, is this for me or not? Is this something that I want to live in my life? And really, the experience of being a Muslim, this change in our lives, right? And for those who kind of actually made that life-changing decision, I'm sure they can appreciate that this is a new lifestyle. Like, I feel so many things have changed, is that there are practical pieces of advice for the journey that we should keep in mind. And keeping this advice in mind really helps make that transition smoother and more healthy. Right? That growing, even the word growth, when we talk about growth, if you look at, for example, like a plant, the way that a plant grows, you have to treat it wisely, because if you water a plant too much, you can actually kill it. And if you water it too little, then it can dry up and wither. So you have to have that right balance, even in growth, even in things that are nutritious and beneficial spiritually and intellectually and so forth, so that that growth is sustainable and healthy. Okay, so these are a few practical pieces of advice. The Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, said, actions are judged according to their intentions. Actions are judged according to their intentions. And this teaches us, this gives us a sense of purpose and intentionality in all that we do. A sense of purpose and intentionality in all that we do. So this is important because as Muslims, this is one of the most often recited ahadith or often recalled statements of the Prophet. And it gives us direction in our lives. That we should be people, and this applies even to those who might be from other faiths or those who are interested in learning about Islam. The benefit is universal, that we as people, when we're engaging in anything, we should really think about why we are doing that. What is the purpose behind me doing this particular thing? What do I want to achieve? What do I want to gain from that? And for a believer, for a Muslim, that goal is always trying to seek further and further nearness to God. Greater and greater nearness to God. So as we come together in this course, thinking about intentions that what do we want to achieve? Why are we here? What are we seeking to learn? And if it's something that's positive, then that's a beautiful thing. And if there's something that might be egotistical or potentially negative or whatever it may be, to really address that and try to realign ourselves to something more useful and beneficial. So that's the first piece of advice. The second is that the journey of Islam is a marathon, it's not a sprint. That even for those who have newly embraced Islam, oftentimes you get a lot of gifts from people, get a lot of books. People, I've seen this, it can be very overwhelming at the beginning for a lot of new Muslims. And, I've seen this happen many, many times, where a person says, I want to declare my shahada, I want to verbally say the 2 testimonies of faith with the community. I want to, formally enter into the fold and the embrace of Islam. When that happens, everyone's like excited. Someone is about to become a Muslim. They're going to, dedicate themselves to God on the path of Islam. And everyone's hugging them. Everyone's saying, now you have 1.6 billion brothers and sisters in the world. You're part of the biggest family. And the person, I've seen so many people, they become elated from the energy and the positive energy in the room. But then I've heard a lot of people say, and then the next day, you're kind of like back to being alone. And it's like, what do I do now? And even if you get a stack of books, books are useful, but that doesn't necessarily sustain a person. And then you also have other people who want to just soak up as much as they can, right? Like Brad, when he was talking to my brother, the young man who became Muslim and kind of started my brother thinking about writing this book, he kept saying, give me more, give me more, give me more. But recognizing that it is a journey. Just like with human beings, if someone wants to commit themselves to some sort of physical regimen, right? I want to get fit. I want to bench press 250 pounds. They don't start off with 250 pounds. They could tear a muscle. They could hurt themselves. But to recognize that it is a long-term process, and you start with the most important things. You start with the primary foundational practices, and then you build up from there, and you build up from there. So some people want to take it all in all at once, everything that I can possibly do. and they're watching YouTube videos and reading all these books and getting really into it. And that excitement's a beautiful thing. That excitement is not to be criticized, but what happens to a lot of people is they get burnt out. And they say, you know what, like I gave it my all, and then as soon as they face some sort of disappointment within themselves, or sometimes disappointment from the community or whatever it may be, they get really turned off, and they just feel like I gave it my all and it didn't go the way that I had hoped. But that a person has to pace themselves, right? Slow and steady wins the race. That's why it's the tortoise and the hare. Subliminal messages, right? But really that there's wisdom in that. And the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, he said that the most beloved actions to God, the most beloved deeds to God are those that are most consistent, even if few, right? Even if small. Is that you recognize that this is something that we want to sustain. Our path to God, our relationship with God is something that we want to continue for 60, 70, 80 years, right? And that we pace ourselves. The next piece of advice for the journey is make good friends. Make good friends. One of the most important things in every aspect of life is the company that you keep. You know, there's, I believe it's a Spanish saying. It says, show me who you walk with and I'll tell you who you are. Right? The people that we choose to surround ourselves with and be in their company, they rub off onto us, right? As one of the great contemporary scholars of Islam, Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad, T.J. Winters, he says, your state is contagious. The state of your heart is contagious. So if it is positive, or you're around people who have positive and radiant states of being and character and faith, then even if we feel, oh, I'm not at that level, it starts to rub off onto us, and we get that benefit. And then the opposite is also true. Is that people who bring us down, bring us down. People who tend to surround themselves or be in environments that are negative, even if we don't agree with those actions, or that we will be affected by that ultimately. And another thing that's really important is that it's actually beautiful, but part of Islam is having that connection of community. The Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, he would refer to the community, this entire collective of believers, of different faiths, of different backgrounds, different ethnicities, different languages, different socio-economic classes, that they were all one ummah, that they were all one body of believers, right? So part of our Islam is that we connect with good people, that we seek out the company of good people. It's not meant to be a journey that we go on alone. And I know for a lot of people who are new to Islam, they feel very lonely sometimes because maybe they left a lot of the company that they were in before just to become Muslim. And in some cases, they actually, their families might even turn their backs on them. And they feel like, who do I have now? So it's extremely important that you seek out the kinds of people who have this positive aura and radiance about them, and who are sincere in their devotion to God. That's an extremely important piece of advice for the journey. Another one is don't lose yourself. Don't lose yourself. Someone might say, what do you mean by this? I've seen this more times than I'd like to admit, where people, they become Muslim and a lot of changes happen very quickly. And some of those changes are not necessarily bad at all, but sometimes it's the speed. Is that Islam that this journey of life that we go on and our walk with God, oftentimes we need time to understand revelation and guidance. That even though we might intellectually get it, like it makes sense, you have to do certain things, that it actually takes time to sink in for a person to realize how this brings them closer to God and how they need to implement this in their life with wisdom. I'll give you just a really simple example. I've seen many young women become Muslim and get married like a month later. And they're just like, I'm Muslim now, I want to do the whole thing, like, and some people might actually, not appreciate the, sort of the sensitive state that new Muslim might be in, and they want to do everything right. They don't want to do anything that might be contradictory to Islamic law or whatever it may be. So they say, I want to get married. I've seen that happen many times. Alhamdulillah, we thank God. In some cases, it works out just fine. But I've seen many cases where they don't know each other very well. One or the other might be still learning about their own self. And, sometimes it just doesn't work out. But it's not because, there was any ill intent. But sometimes it's just like you're at a certain stage right now where you just need a little bit of time to grow. Or someone will completely abandon their own culture. And they'll wear just as an example, nothing wrong with it, but they'll wear shalwar kameez, which is like a South Asian clothing. And it's nice clothing. There's nothing wrong with it, but it's like, you're not Pakistani. You're Irish Canadian or something, where did you? And then their family is like, what's wrong with our son? He looks like those dudes on TV. He's wearing the same clothes, and it's just like, what happened? And then or it'll be like, I became Muslim yesterday. My parents called me Mike. All my friends growing up called me Mike. And then within 3 days, it's Abdul Rashid, Abdul Khalil, Al-Maliki, Al-Hanafi, Al-Amriki. And I've seen people with names like that on Facebook. That's you got 6 different Arabic names, bro. Your name is Mike Smith. What happened? And people are just like, dude, Mike lost it. He's looks like he joined a cult. He changed everything. And it's not that, it's not that people can't change their names if they don't want to, or they don't have to change their names if they don't want to. If you have a nice name, you have a nice name. The Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, he wouldn't change people's names unless their names had negative meanings. Sometimes the Arabs would do that, kind of. Sometimes they would have really harsh names in the Arabian Peninsula so that they would scare people. My name is the one who brings pain. They're like, I don't want to mess with that guy. So the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, he would change people's names in those cases. Otherwise, if there was nothing wrong with it, they would keep their names, right? So these are just certain things that can occur, in the experiences of someone who newly embraced Islam, right? So don't lose yourself. All of, culture, that's another important conversation that we'll get into more as we go along. But that culture is something that could be very positive. It could be, in some cases, it could be negative. And in most cases, it can be neutral. Right? Are French fries Islamic or not? No. You like French fries. You like, hamburgers. You like biryani. Doesn't really affect your relationship with God. That's cultural preference. So you can still be true to who you are. You can still, if you like, running, that's totally fine. You like certain sports or you like certain hobbies that don't contradict, that don't have any harm within them, then it's totally fine to be that person. And sometimes people try to change who they are, and then they realize that that's really difficult and they haven't been true to themselves, and then they start to doubt their own place within the community of believers, right? But Islam, Imam Zayd Shakir, one of one of the most prominent Muslim scholars in North America, who's at Zaytuna College, he says, come to Islam as you are, come as you are to Islam as it is. Right? It's a beautiful balance. Come as you are a unique human being, and then come to Islam as it is, and conform to those things that are beloved to God. And then, most things are that come within the realm of culture or personal preference, there's room for that. They're usually neutral, as long as they don't contradict anything. Okay, moving on. So Islam in context. As I mentioned before, this course, the point behind this course is really to understand Islam, not in kind of like an academic sense. We're not looking at Islam historically. We're not looking at Islam, from an outsider's perspective, but to understand Islam as Muslims understand Islam. Right? So I think that's a really important detail, because it gives people a sense of, what do Muslims really say about this? Right? Like, how would a Muslim understand certain concepts or beliefs or practices? Right? So that's I think, kind of important to give an idea about that. The first thing is that the entire goal and the entire purpose of revelation and of religion and of Islam is to know God. And this, this slide, it is the Arabic writing of God's name, Allah. And Allah, people have probably heard this, right? Allah, they believe in Allah, they don't believe in God, it's not the same, and so forth. Allah is the Arabic word for God. And Allah, it means, according to some scholars, kind of the way that they would describe its meaning, it just means the God, al-ilah, the God, right? The one true God, Allah. And what's really funny is that Arab Christians, right, if you see like translations of the Bible or whatever it may be, Arab Christians, what do they say in Arabic for God? They say Allah. Right? So it's not like some separate thing altogether. A lot of people feel, oh, this is like really foreign. This is really something very different. And some people will even go to the extent of making up false claims and saying, oh, this was some other deity that they try to say is God. But we'll talk about sort of the attributes of God and what we mean by God when we're talking about God. About Allah, glorious and exalted. Yes, Maya.
I read somewhere that the difference between like the term God versus Allah is that God, it can be pluralized, whereas like Islam, is monotheism. You can't pluralize Allah.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very wise sort of. That's a very wise sort of wisdom or extrapolation that someone received from that. But the thing is, that's true. You can't pluralize Allah because you can't pluralize Allah. But in the Arabic language, there is a plural form of gods that sounds similar, right? So aliha. Aliha is like the plural. Ilah is God. Allah is the one true only God, right? So the Arabs, they had in their language the concept of a plurality of deities, but the name Allah, this kind of supreme and clear name of God, is kind of defines the one God, that there's no other like Him. So that could be a wisdom that some scholars have noted, or some Muslims have noted. And the most important thing is to recognize that the entire purpose of revelation and religion, which we'll get to, is to draw closer to God. is that Muslims believe that we're all created by God, and we're all honored through that creation, and that the purpose of our creation is to know our Lord, is to know God. There is a saying from one of the sages of Islam. It's a very profound saying. And he said that every human being, and maybe some of us have experienced this and felt this to varying degrees. He said that every human being has a hole in their heart. Every human being has a hole in their heart. And we find different ways to fill that hole. Right? A lot of people are always looking. You see this a lot with human beings in general, just kind of human sociological behavior. We're always looking for something more. Right? Sometimes that's materially. People just want to buy a lot of stuff. Sometimes it's attachment to just different things. But this scholar said that there is a hole in your heart that can only be filled by God. That we as human beings, we have this spiritual memory of our nearness to God. This is an extremely important concept, and it actually defines the entire religion and the entire purpose of religion and the entire purpose of revelation. We're told in the Quran that when God created the souls of all of humanity, He brought them in His presence and asked them a question. He addressed them. And He said, "Am I not your Lord? Alastu bi rabbikum?" The Quran tells us about this divine address. And everyone, because at that moment, being in the presence of God and being in the heavenly realm, no soul would ever deny that. Am I not your Lord? And every human being who was created, is living, and will come, said, "Indeed you are. We bear witness to the fact that you are our Lord." Just by a show of hands, how many people remember that address? How many people remember this conversation? Nobody, none of you guys? Nobody?
Conversation with God?
Yeah, the conversation with God.
Pretty deep question.
It's a pretty deep question, yeah. So most people would say, I don't remember that. And that would be a fair answer because it's not a mental memory. It's not a memory that we remember in our minds, but it is a spiritual memory that is hidden within us. And that the purpose of our lives in this world is to honor that covenant that we made with God. And revelation gives us the keys to recognizing that reality and cultivating that reality and making our hearts and souls directed towards God. Because initially, according to the Muslim understanding of the human being, the metaphysical reality of the human being is that we are by our souls honored, not through our bodies, right? Bodies are considered to be earthly things, but it is our soul, it is the spiritual divine gift that we have within us that truly makes us honored. Because our souls are heavenly and our bodies are earthly, and our souls are looking to go back to that place, to go back to that higher realm that we were previously in. So within Islam, we believe in the story of the creation, and we believe this to be true because it is described as such by God through revelation of the creation of Adam and Eve, which is in also the Hebrew Bible and the Abrahamic tradition. That human beings had a starting point and God created Adam. And Adam was honored by God, by Allah, and God commanded the angels to bow down to Adam. Not out of worship, but as an honor to humanity. That this human being who was created and all who comes after him, of human beings, male and female, are honored beings of God, are honored creatures of God. Now we believe also in the devil. That there was a creature, a creation, who was not an angel. We'll talk a little bit more about these unseen beings called the jinn that we believe in, who was of the jinn, kind of another species that God created, who also have free will. He refused to bow down to Adam. He refused God's command. And he expressed, the epitome of arrogance at the direct command of God. So what happens, just to kind of focus on the heart of the story, what happens is that Satan, the devil, tells Adam and Eve to eat from this forbidden fruit. But what's interesting in the Quran is that God says in the Quran, Satan made them both slip. That this event that occurs kind of in the Abrahamic revelation tradition of Adam and Eve and kind of being expelled from the garden because of disobeying God, is that the blame is not put on one gender or the other. Is that both of them ate from the apple and they both made a mistake. So that's important because human beings, we started off in this abode of nearness and intimacy with our Creator. But through this mistake, human beings were brought down to earth. That they were brought down to this earthly realm. But God gave us the ability to find our way back. That now human beings, and this was known in God's wisdom and was part of His will to begin with, that human beings would be given the opportunity to find guidance back to that heavenly realm. So, a lot of people wonder, what is the purpose of life? Why am I here? Even that question, why am I here? There's almost like a subtle realization that I'm not from here. So why am I here? What brought me here in the first place? Because it seems kind of foreign. If someone felt part and parcel, they would say, I'm here because this is where I'm from. But why am I here? What's the purpose of life? And, from an Islamic understanding, the purpose of life is to get back to God. Right? To seek this path of understanding and guidance and reconnecting with our Creator, glorious and exalted. When in the Quran, when God is teaching us about the story of the expulsion of Adam and Eve from paradise, from the garden, God promises, but I will send guidance. That this is not a permanent expulsion, and that I will send guidance, and whoever follows that guidance will ultimately return here. Right? Whoever follows that guidance will ultimately return here. So within Islam, we believe in a Creator. We believe that the existence requires an all-powerful being to bring it from non-existence into existence. We don't believe as Muslims that it's illogical to believe in something like infinite regression. And we'll talk more about that when we discuss the attributes of God in the next sessions moving forward. But that there is our Creator. There is a God, this unseen, infinitely perfect Creator. And God has given us the ability to find our way back to Him. And that is the role of prophets and messengers and scriptures. That it would be obvious if God communicated with us directly. It wouldn't take any human being any effort on their part if it was a non-question. But God willed that He would communicate with His creation through chosen beings who are the prophets and messengers, and that He would send His guidance in the form of scriptures. And these scriptures are to remind us, deep down inside, you remember where you came from. That these scriptures speak to the very core of our being and realign us with the purpose of our existence. God also tells us in the Quran and with every prophet and messenger that people were very resistant. That their attachment to the worldly life and their egos made them resistant to guidance from God. And that over time, that we believe within Islam that there were many prophets and messengers throughout human history. Many prophets and messengers throughout human history, that every people was sent a prophet by God. We don't know the names of all of them, but that every people historically have been sent prophets by God so that they know how to live their lives in this world. We also believe that over time, a lot of that message was lost. That human beings, as generations change, times change, that certain things, when people were close to the message and the prophets and messengers, they would receive it directly. But after that prophet or messenger would pass away, things would get lost. So when it came to a point where people were distant from the original message that God had sent them, another prophet or messenger or scripture would be sent. We believe as Muslims that occurred throughout history, and God concluded prophecy and concluded revelation with the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, and gave us the guarantee that this revelation would be preserved by God Himself, and that it would not be altered and it would not be lost. And that the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, is the prophet and messenger who actually is the culmination, is the embodiment of all of the previous prophets and messengers and their guidance. And that he is the conclusion of revelation and the conclusion of prophethood till the end of time, to the end of human existence in this world. And that the Quran is unaltered. So we believe that we started off with God. We were brought down into this world, and we have a way back, and that is through revelation, and that is through prophets and messengers. Is that making sense so far? Is everything kind of building up upon itself? Does anyone have any questions or comments so far? This is really important because when we talk about Islam and we talk about religion, people can say certain things like, why do you cover your hair? Why do you not eat this? That's so weird. Why do you not drink anything? Oh man, that's really awkward because in our family we drink all the time. That would be so weird. And it's just, they start to notice these outward things. And it sometimes becomes a barrier of talking about, why are we even here? Have you ever thought about that? Don't worry about what I eat or don't eat or, what kind of activities I engage in or Muslims engage in. Let's just talk about the big questions. And when we understand those big questions and we go in this kind of systematic, if A, then B, if B, then C, and then we can understand that when God sends these revelations, that there's certain ways to live by in order to achieve that nearness to the divine. Now we'll move into the three dimensions of Islam. The three dimensions of Islam. And this is something that I personally find to be very profound. This is a hadith, and hadith is an Arabic word that technically, when we speak about it in an Islamic context, it means sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. Sayings, actions, or things that he allowed. They are called hadith in Arabic, right? Largely compiling the sayings and teachings and character of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. So this is one of the most important and most authoritative ahadith, the most authoritative narrations, prophetic narrations in the entire corpus of hadith literature. In all of Islamic teaching, this is considered to be one of the most central and most important. And this hadith, the hadith Jibreel, it's known as the narration of Gabriel, the angel Gabriel, upon him be peace, is of the highest level of authenticity. So within hadith literature, when scholars and the community of Muslims were compiling the statements of the Prophet, they had a very intricate system of authenticating if this was actually a statement from the Prophet or something that someone said. So to make a long story short, this meets the requirements of the highest level of authenticity, which is mutawatir. In Arabic, it is called mutawatir, which means massively transmitted. What that means is that there were many people who witnessed this occurrence with the Prophet, and they conveyed it to many people, and they conveyed it to many people, and so forth. Right? So I'll just give you a human example of that. Like, what does that mean? Has anyone been to Australia? You've been to Australia? Anyone been to China? Man, you've been everywhere. Like, I'm trying to find one that you haven't been to. Anyone been to the moon? Or Mars? Let's do that. Anyone been to Mars? Okay. Yeah? Uh-oh. Now I'd get worried. Does it exist?
Yeah.
How do you haven't been there?
Textbooks.
So there is an authority that, so for example, let's just use Australia, because that's easier. I haven't been to Australia, but if I told you all I haven't been to Australia, I haven't seen it, I haven't stepped on its shores, I don't believe it exists. Someone say, man, there's like millions of people, who've been to Australia, it's there, like, trust me, it's real. That is actually what hadith mutawatir is that it's something that's massively transmitted. So it reaches the highest levels of authenticity that it would be actually silly to deny. You're like, there's so many people who are confirming this. Or if, for example, someone says, I just heard on the news that it's raining in Toronto. And then you see someone and say, oh yeah, I was just in Toronto, it's raining. And then you hear someone else talking about how it's raining in Toronto, and then you say, I don't believe it's raining in Toronto. It's been massively transmitted to you. We would, as human beings, we would immediately accept it. If someone asks us, they say, hey, you're going to Toronto, be careful, it's raining. Well, how do you know that? Well, it's been massively transmitted to me. So that's the level of authenticity about this hadith. Another important characteristic of this particular event in the life of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, is that it occurred towards the end of his life, the end of his prophetic mission, the very end. Okay? So the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, was receiving revelation from God for 23 years. And this happened at the very end of it. And all of that is important just to give a little bit of background of how central this is to the entire understanding of Islam. Okay? And now we'll get into the narration. So what occurs? The companions are sitting around the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, and upon all the prophets and messengers. And this mysterious man approaches him. And they say this man was wearing bright, white, clean clothing, had dark hair. None of us knew who he was. None of us recognized him. And in those times, it was a very tightly knit community. They said none of us knew him, recognized him, and none of us saw any signs of travel. Like if he's not from there, he's from somewhere else. But his clothes are so crisp and clean that he couldn't have been traveling. So immediately they feel like this is something unique, that something special is going on right now. And this man comes up directly, very close to the Prophet Muhammad, and he says, "Oh Muhammad, what is Islam? What is Islam?" And for those taking notes, let's put Islam as a lowercase I. Okay, what is Islam? And he asks this series of questions which become very important for the Muslim community in the understanding of the religion. The Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, says, Islam is to testify that there is no God but God, that Muhammad is the messenger of God, to perform the prayers, to pay the purifying charity, to fast in Ramadan, and Ramadan being the 9th month of the Islamic calendar, to fast in the month of Ramadan, and to make the pilgrimage to the sacred house if you are able to do so. So the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, responds with what is commonly referred to as the 5 pillars of Islam. Okay? The man, this mystery man, says, "You've spoken the truth." The companions around the Prophet are confused. They said, how is he going to ask a question and confirm the answer? As if he already knew the answer. They found the whole kind of exchange to be unique. So then he asks the second question. And he says, what is Iman? And I'm going to translate these terms, but I want you to write them down in sort of their Arabic form because they're technical terms that we're going to come back to in a little bit. What is Iman? I-M-A-N, Iman. And the Prophet replies and says, to believe, it is to believe in God, His angels, His scriptures, His messengers, the last day, and to believe in divine destiny or divine decree, both the good and evil thereof. So then the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, lists 6 different things: to believe in God, to believe in His angels, His scriptures, His messengers, the last day, i.e. the day of judgment, the day of resurrection, and to believe in divine decree, the evil and good, the good and evil thereof. The man once again says, you've spoken the truth. Very interesting kind of exchange and dialogue. Then he asks the third question, and each of these 3 questions makes up one of the dimensions of Islam, of the religion, of the entire religion. Then he asks the third question, what is ihsan? I-H-S-A-N. What is ihsan? And the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, says, it is to worship God as though you see Him. Ihsan is to worship God as though you see Him, and if you do not see Him, knowing that truly He sees you. Then the fourth question, and we're going to focus primarily on the first 3, but then this mystery man asks a fourth question, and he says, tell me about the hour. Tell me about the end of time. And the Prophet replies and says, the one questioned about it knows no better than the questioner. Then this mystery man says, tell me about its signs. And the Prophet replies and says that the slave girl will give birth to her mistress. That a slave girl will give birth, will mother her own mistress, her own master. And you will see barefoot, naked, destitute herdsmen, shepherds, competing in the construction of lofty buildings. And it's interesting because these signs, we'll talk about them in a little bit, but it's like, interesting, that almost, what does that mean? What exactly does that mean? that a slave girl will give birth to her master, and you will see a barefoot, naked shepherd competing with one another in the construction of lofty buildings. Then the man leaves. The man leaves. So he comes out of nowhere, and he sort of vanishes into thin air once again. He leaves physically, but they don't see him again. They don't know where he goes. So then the Prophet Muhammad asks one of his companions, do you know who that was? And his companion says, God and his messenger know better. God and his messenger know best. And the Prophet says that was Gabriel. That was the greatest of all the angels. And he came in the form of a human being, and he said he came to teach you your religion. He came to teach you your religion. 4 questions with relatively brief answers. What is Islam? What is Iman? What is Ihsan? And then a question about the end of time. That those 4 questions, they're kind of like the summary of the entire religion. So we'll focus on the first 3 to begin with. Does anyone have any questions about the hadith itself, about the narration itself? Is it pretty straightforward? So it happens towards the very end of the Prophet's life in this world. So he's been teaching his companions for years and years and years, receiving all of this revelation. And this incident, this event occurs to really simplify and summarize everything in a very easily understood and concise way. But it has profound depth, and we're going to look at the depth right now. So scholars, when they were looking at Islam with the lowercase I, the first question, they said what's interesting about the first question is that it relates entirely to things that you do. So the shahada, which is the testimony of faith, is something that's what? It's verbal. It's verbal. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. I bear witness that there is no God except God, that Muhammad is the messenger of God. It's something that you do. So that's the first answer. Yes, do you have a question?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Children that are born into Muslim families, do they say their shahada?
That's a very good question. In any formal way, they wouldn't. In any formal way, they wouldn't. But the thing is, if you notice in the prayer, say it all the time, right? So it's said explicitly in every single prayer. So it's not, there isn't a sort of practice within Islam where there's like a celebration of now you've decided to become Muslim. That children within Islam actually are born, and we'll talk a little bit about that more when we talk about sort of the metaphysical, spiritual side of Islam. They're born with a healthy sense of God. And unless it's sort of corrupted as they grow up, if it's cultivated, it usually aligns very naturally with their primordial nature. So it's not something that's formally done. But it's something verbal, right? It's something that's verbal. Prayer, the 5 daily prayers, it's something that you physically do. I remember I had a coworker, a nice lady. She one time I had to go pray, and she was from another faith. She wasn't Muslim. So one time I had to go pray, and it was kind of busy at work. So she asked me, she said, "Can you just pray in your head?" And I was like, "No, I can't." Like, it was so interesting, just once again, kind of things that you take for granted and things that other people might not necessarily understand intrinsically. So she said, "Can you just pray in your head?" And I was like, "No, I'll be back in 5 minutes though." It won't take too long. So that's the second thing. The third thing, paying the purifying charity. And this is, in Arabic, it's called zakat. Zakat is sort of paying alms, giving an obligatory charity, to people in need. And for those who are eligible. There's a certain technicality around that we won't go into right now. But it's something that you do. You physically are giving away some of your wealth for God to people in need. The fasting Ramadan. It's a physical abstinence. You're abstaining from food and drink and fasting. And then the pilgrimage, the rite of pilgrimage, the Hajj, which is something that's also done physically. So scholars have said that the first question, the first dimension of the religion is Islam, which pertains to the practice and the worship of God done through the medium of the body. Done through the medium of the body. So that's the first one. Okay? The word Islam in Arabic means to surrender or to submit to the reality of that which God commands us to do. So this lowercase I of Islam is to practice, to conform to the worship and practice that's done through the medium of the body. So that's the first dimension. The second dimension, the second question, which was Iman. What is Iman? Iman in Arabic means to believe, or it's sometimes translated as faith. And what that is, and it's actually quite beautiful, is within the Islamic tradition of learning and understanding revelation, is that revelation is understood through reason and the intellect. That the mind, the intellect, intelligence, and reason is actually a gift from God for us to identify and recognize the truth. So reason and religion in Islamic history have never been at odds with each other, or science and religion, or whatever it may be. They haven't been at odds with one another. In order for us as human beings to believe something, it has to make sense. It has to make sense. If I tell you to believe in something that's logically impossible, that would be a really mean trick to play. Because most people, that doesn't make any sense. How am I supposed to accept that if it doesn't make sense intellectually? So Iman, to believe in God, His angels, His scriptures, is the understanding that we have of the divine and all that relates to the unseen through revelation from the divine, understanding that through the intellect so that belief can take root in the heart. Is that it has to make sense to us before it can become a belief and conviction. And then that's something that is encouraged. And you find the science within Islam, the discipline within Islam that this really pertains to is the science of theology, of aqeedah, of understanding what do we know about God? What do we know about existence? How do we know what we know? This is a rich, rich tradition within Islam, and something that Muslim scholars have never really shied away from, because these are the big questions that make people know the reality of God. Right? So this is the second of our dimensions of religion, which is done through the medium of the mind. Our connection and worship and understanding of God that we achieve through using our intellect. Through using our intellect. The third question is, what is ihsan? What is ihsan? The word ihsan in Arabic, the literal, the linguistic definition is to make something beautiful, to beautify. And Islam is a deen of beautification. Not just external beautification, because that only lasts so long, but of true internal beautification, being an embodiment of beauty. The Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, said, "Truly God is beautiful and He loves beauty." And the deepest and most significant forms of that beauty are spiritual beauty, beauty of character, beauty of one's heart and one's soul. And ihsan is, as the Prophet described, to worship God as if you see Him, and if you do not see Him, knowing that He sees you. And this is the internal constitution of the human being. That we witness, or even when we talk about getting close to God, when a Muslim says getting close to God, or nearness to God, or witnessing God, that's not something that's physical. That's not something that's physical at all. It's something that we experience through our soul and through our heart. And that is the third dimension of Islam. Just to touch a little bit upon the fourth question, because someone might say, what's the fourth question? The fourth question was, when is the hour? When is the end of time? And the scholars have said that this question was to indicate the moral decline of this worldly existence over time. And that for people of faith to identify that decline and to hold on even more closely to God's guidance in those times of moral corruption and misguidance. And it's also very important, there's also a very important element in this, because the Prophet says to Gabriel, upon both of them, may God's peace be, he says, you and I know the same amount about it. So he says, tell me its signs. And then the Prophet says, a slave girl will give birth to her master or her mistress, and you'll see barefoot, destitute, naked shepherds building lofty buildings. Can anyone recognize where that is? That picture right there? That's a real pic. It's a drawing, but it's actually of like a real place. It's Dubai. Like maybe, 30 years ago? That was like all desert. There's probably some goats, some shepherds. And now you have, as the Prophet Muhammad 1400 years ago prophesied and told us that there will come a time that the signs of the end of this world, one of them is that you will find desert people who not that long ago were shepherds and kind of not the most civilized, in kind of a civilizational definition of that word, not the most civilized people competing in building tall buildings. Now I think in Kuwait or something, they want to build like a kilometer-high building, and they just keep like trying to outdo one another, right? Trying to outdo one another. That's an amazing sort of sign. And scholars have said the meaning of a slave girl giving birth to her mistress is that the goodness that children generally would show their parents would flip, and that children would treat their parents like they were their own slaves and mistreat them. That there would be an inversion of the normal moral character of human beings. That things would flip towards the end of time. So that's just a little bit about the hour, and we're almost done here, but just to look at harmonizing the three dimensions of Islam, the three dimensions of the religion. This hadith, and this is important because everything that we're going to look at and anything that you learn within your pursuit, is it visible okay there? Does it look okay? Anything that you learn in your pursuit of studying Islam and understanding this revelation and guidance and so forth is going to have some effect in regards to one of these three or all of these three. But Islam is about harmonizing the mind, body, and soul in obedience and worship of the divine. That us as human beings, we are made up of a body, of a mind, and of a soul, and that Islam, which is this complete and perfect, as Muslims believe it to be, and as said in the Quran by God, "Al-yawm akmaltu lakum dinakum." Today I have perfected your religion. It is complete. That it actually addresses the human being on every level of their existence. The physical, the intellectual, and the spiritual. And seeking and attaining, achieving that harmony of all three, if you see in the middle, that uppercase Islam, that is the goal, is to achieve all three in this harmony and balance, then that is Islam with the uppercase I. That is the deen. That is the way that the religion is meant to be practiced. And whenever there's an imbalance in one, it's not truly representative of Islam. So for example, if someone neglects belief or faith or the aspect of the mind, then it becomes a cultural practice. I do certain things, I dress a certain way, that has a significance to me in this way. What does it have to do with God? Nothing. So that's just kind of cultural practice. And if you neglect the external, for example, if you neglect Islam with the lowercase I, you neglect practice, and it just has faith and spiritual cultivation, it becomes a very abstract religion. Well, it's kind of like this. I can't explain it because I'm just feeling it, and I believe these things, and I experience these things, and it's like, well, that might be you. How can I do that? How can I live according to that religion, right? And as Maya was saying earlier on our way over here, Islam is not just this subjective way of life. Well, this is what it means to me. No, there are certain things that are true. There are certain things that we have to do. And it kind of gives a clear and objective way of practice. And then if you neglect the spiritual side, if you miss out on the spirit, then it just becomes this very cold and legalistic. It becomes a body without a soul. You got to do this, you can't do this, you got to do that. Okay, what for? This is how it is. This is the command. Don't question it. But when you have all three, then you achieve that balance and that harmony. And that's important because that really is what Islam is. It is a human being achieving a sense of complete harmony in the purpose of their creation, which is to worship God. And that kind of concludes our first session of being Muslim. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. And all praise and thanks belong to God, the Lord of the worlds. Does anyone have any questions regarding what we covered today? Yes, Ahmed.
Say a few more words about the third question, Hadith Jibreel, especially, actually in specific, about worship him as if you can see him.
That's a wonderful question. So Ahmed was asking about worshipping. The third question, what is ihsan? To worship God as if you see him. And if you do not see him, knowing that he sees you. Muslim scholars, masters of the spiritual tradition within Islam, they've actually used technical terms to define both of those things. So the first one is mushahada, is witnessing God. And what that means is when a person refines, and we'll talk a little bit more about it in the session on spiritual refinement, when a person refines their heart and cleanses their heart from worldly and egotistical influences, it becomes a mirror of seeing higher realities. And the highest of all and the true reality is Allah, is God. So worshiping God as if one sees them is a high level that a person is witnessing God in every moment. And I think many of us probably have moments where we get a heightened sense of that, even if it's not all the time. Like when you see a beautiful sunrise. Who's doing that? I'm not just enjoying, oh no, that's just, when the light hits through the clouds and it, deflects and it becomes all these different, shades of color. We're not looking at it as a scientific observation. We're in a state of witnessing. You're not appreciating the art, you appreciate the artist. So who did that? Right? So that's perhaps one practical example of mushahada. And then scholars say if a person is not able to be in that state where they're always witnessing, God, His will and knowledge and power in the world or in their life, then at the very least become aware that He is seeing you. And that at the very least should instill within us a sense of determination to worship Him and keep us away from disobeying. Right? So that's the first is called mushahada, witnessing. And then they say, the part, and knowing that He sees you. If you do not see Him, knowing that He sees you is called muraqaba, is vigilance, vigilantly being aware. It's really simple. Like if you know someone's in the room, you might not be as comfortable doing certain things as if you were alone, right? So if you're aware that God is aware of all that you do, and you're consciously aware of that, right? Not just as a theory, oh, God sees me in this moment, it will affect our practice and our behavior. So those are kind of the two sides of that answer. One here and then, yes. Alaykum salam wa rahmatullah.
What would you say to someone who's in that new convert state of zeal, and they see themselves in it, but they're having a hard time slowing down?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's important to really be there for them and show them a lot of love and support. But also, there are a hadith, also sort of encourage them in whatever ways. Because if you explain it to people, especially when they're feeling very excited, it seems counterintuitive. You want me to slow down? Like, are you telling me to? So the question was, if someone is a new convert and they're showing a lot of zeal, they're showing a lot of excitement, and they might be taking on too much all at once. How do you sort of help them kind of, go a little bit steady, right, and slow down a bit? It might seem like it's counterintuitive to them, but there are a hadith where the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, says Islam is heavy. The entirety of Islam is heavy, and whoever takes it completely upon themselves is broken by it. The Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, said that. And scholars have also said that, one of the tricks of the devil is to make a person feel really excited. Oh, Qiyam al-Layl, right? Oh, there's, the night prayer, praying in the middle of the night. There's so much reward for that. And a person wakes up at 3 a.m. and they start it, and they've never kind of woken up at that time in their lives before, and they're praying. They do that for 3 days, and then on the 4th day, they miss the Fajr obligatory prayer. They're just exhausted, like, I can't do this. And it might actually have greater detrimental effect, right? So one thing is to teach them to sort of prioritize. Like, what's the most important thing? The most important thing is, increasing your understanding of God, increasing your connection to the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, understanding the Sunnah, the prophetic way, not just as a bunch of do's and don'ts, but as a system of being, a way of being human that takes a long time to really perfect and understand. And even just mentioning sometimes to them, did you know that the Quran was revealed over the course of 23 years? And the community had time to really prioritize and grow over that time period, right? So we're not expected to be super Muslim overnight. And we're expected to prioritize, and that, even in a physical sense, right? That there's a healthy sense of growth and so forth. And ultimately just being there and showing them a lot of love and support. And when you build that trust and that, that they know that you really care about them, they'll take that advice more seriously, inshallah. There's a question? Mm-hmm.
So there's a question online. How does one go about attaining Iman, leaving their own notions and put on the lens of Iman?
That's a nice question. So one thing is there's many different ways to increase in Iman and faith. So one thing is, sure, the question was, how do you increase in Iman? And how do you look through the lens of Iman in all that you do? Is that accurate? One thing, Iman being belief or being strength of one's faith, there's a beautiful chapter, and this is for someone, this is a little bit of an advanced kind of step, depending on where this person is in their life and so forth. But I would look at a chapter in a beautiful, beautiful book, the first chapter of a book called The Book of Assistance, by a Yemeni scholar who lived about 4 centuries ago. The first chapter of the book is on certainty, certainty being this really deep level of faith. And he talks about the ways to cultivate that certainty. But it's all rooted in a greater understanding and reflection and knowledge of God. The more we know about God, the more that we know about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as He has described Himself in the Quran, in Revelation, that we can't always just assume that we know what God is or what the attributes of God are. We might have kind of a spiritual sense, but we need to actually learn, what do we believe about God? What attributes does God have? And so on and so forth. And cultivating it, Imam al-Haddad says, through first and foremost reflecting on the Quran in which God describes Himself. And then there are also other ways, reflecting on the creation of the heavens and the earth, looking at nature, looking at the order. And then it also is something that takes a little bit of time and practice. You know, al-ilm bil-ta'allum wal-hilm bil-tahallum. That, gaining knowledge, becoming knowledgeable is through consistently devoting oneself to seeking it. And becoming forbearant, attaining a quality, you attain it through these degrees of mimicking it until it becomes natural. So even when it comes to cultivating faith, is that you try to bring things back to faith. You try to remember. And one of the most important practices, spiritual practices within Islam, that we'll talk about, inshallah, this is just a very kind of brief introduction, is dhikr, is the remembrance of God. That when a person physically, with their tongue, they're doing certain invocations of remembrance, that begins to illuminate the heart. And then the heart is more saturated with faith. And, we go through things in life and we relate it back to God. We relate it back to the hereafter. We relate it back to our faith more naturally. But it also is a process of working towards that. And God knows best. Okay.
So far we know about Islam, Iman, Ihsan, but quoting from Imam Nawawi's hadith, the signs of the hour, shouldn't we be aware of those as well?
That's a very important point. Actually, some scholars, there is a contemporary scholar, his name is Habib Abu Bakr al-Mashhur. He makes the argument that there's actually 4 pillars or 4 dimensions of the religion. And he argues that 4th question is a science that every Muslim should be aware of and should know. And he says that it is the science of the changing states of the world. Fiqh al-tahawulat. The science, the revelationary science of understanding the trend of the existence of this world. So he makes an argument for that. Other ulama have said that these 3, the first 3, are particularly, pertaining, if you pertain to the last day and the signs of the last day, and include it under Iman, and our belief in the akhirah, and our belief in the hereafter, and our belief in the way to successfully, to be successful in the hereafter. They say that the 3 dimensions, the first 3 questions pertain to knowledge that is an obligation upon every Muslim. I have not heard, and I don't know everything, and if anyone has proof otherwise, I would be happy to accept it if it's sound. But I've never heard from scholars that it is an obligation upon every Muslim to know the signs of the hour. That it is useful and beneficial, but never heard that it's an obligation. And if you look at the books of Fard Ayn knowledge, of obligatory knowledge, that are introductory books for kind of those who want to learn the very basics that we all must practice and believe and experience, the states of the heart, that's not always included. But it doesn't mean that it's not important. It's very important. Yeah, and like I said, as Habib Abu Bakr al-Mashhur argues that it's something that we need to revive the knowledge of, and it gives us a better understanding of the age that we're living in and what the appropriate response is in a way that is guidance from God. Awesome. Thank you all very much. May God bless and reward you all for coming out, and for those who are watching online. We ask Allah, we ask God for His enabling grace towards that which is most pleasing to Him, and that He bring our hearts together in respect and love and dignity and compassion for one another, and that He shows us truth as truth and enables us to follow it, and shows us falsehood as falsehood and enables us to avoid it. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. And may the peace and blessings of God be upon the Prophet Muhammad and upon all prophets and messengers, and all praise belongs to God.